And hello, good morning. Welcome to Kelowna Now Live. I'm Jason Mann with Jim Check, and we are joined this morning by Kevin Falcon. Hello, Kevin. Welcome to Kelowna Now.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Yeah. Now, Kevin, your role is officially, I guess, the critic of our current NDP government and the leader of the party, BC United.
That's right.
Where do we want to start? Do you want to talk about the name, or do you want to talk about carbon tax?
Let's start with carbon tax.
Sure.
I mean, axe the tax, or where would your party be with that?
So we came out with a very clear position 2 weeks ago, and what we said essentially is that first, the context. We have to understand we brought in the revenue neutral carbon tax, and the point behind that was that by law, every penny had to go back to British Columbians in the form of lower personal income taxes and lower business taxes. And that's how it went for many, many years. In fact, I was the Minister of Finance in 2012 that froze the carbon tax at its current, not its current level today, but at its level at that time, which was about 6 cents a litre for gasoline. We kept it that way through subsequent finance ministers until the NDP got elected in 2017, and then they did two things that I think really undermined support. One is they said we're no longer going to return money to the public. So they turned it from a tax shift into a tax grab. So they took all the money into the provincial government. Then they more than doubled the carbon tax. And the plan that David Eby has working with Justin Trudeau is to more than triple it over the next 7 years. And we've said that that is just not acceptable at a time when the public is really struggling. And so we've been very clear. No further increases in carbon tax will be supported by us. We've also said that since the Prime Minister has said that folks on the East Coast will get a carbon tax relief from their oil-heated homes, that should apply on the West Coast here in British Columbia for whether it's natural gas, propane, or oil-fueled homes. So this is, and we went further actually, we also said no more carbon tax on the agricultural sector because we think that that is an input cost that just drives inflationary pressures at the grocery store. And the final thing we said was we were going to scrap the provincial fuel tax. This is totally within the province's control. We've called for that to be provide relief to British Columbians earlier. The government refused to do so. We've now said we would permanently eliminate that 15 cent a litre tax on British Columbians. And that means that for someone driving a Ford F-150, for example, they would save about $35 per fill. And for a lot of tradespeople that, use their vehicles a lot, that could be, you fill it up every week, $130, $40 a month is a significant saving. So that's our position now.
Yeah, that's over a couple $100
a
week in income.
It adds up,
right?
Absolutely.
The province, what else can the province do to help alleviate some of the inflationary pressure that we're having? Is there anything else that the province can do?
Oh, there's lots, the province can do. This, I think this is actually the number one issue facing British Columbians. I mean, the media confirmed a couple of weeks ago, British Columbia is the most unaffordable province in the entire country. And, I do think there has to be accountability in government. This government's been there for 7 years now. We've ended up with the most expensive real estate in North America. We've got the highest fuel prices in North America. We've got the most expensive, highest average rents in the entire country. Some of the highest inflationary growth pressures on food and groceries. So people really are struggling. A recent poll found that 50% of British Columbians are $200 a month are $200 a month or less away from being able to meet their family budgets. That's a real problem. So we do have to be thinking about how we reduce costs, not how we talk about affordability, but how we actually reduce costs for British Columbians. And I think our 15 cent a litre tax relief, our removal of the carbon tax, our fight to say no further increases, and I'll go further. As one of the reporters said to me at the press conference, they said, well, what if Pierre Poilievre wins the next election and eliminates the carbon tax as he's promised to do? And I said, look, if he eliminates the carbon tax across Canada, BC is not going to be the only jurisdiction with a carbon tax. Ours goes too. And we will look at other ways that we can make improvements to the environment. There are lots of other ways that we can do really good things, and that's what we'll focus on.
Do you have any in mind? Have you thought about what some of those ways might be?
Yeah, like for example, one of the biggest investments in the history of the country is actually taking place in British Columbia right now. That's the over $40 billion investment in liquefied natural gas, a project started by the BC Liberals, now called BC United, a project that was strongly opposed by the current NDP government and a lot of other groups out there. But the reason we did that, and the reason why I'm so excited about that, is because that liquefied natural gas, which we will export to Asia, There's countries like China, Japan, India, Korea. Now in Europe, for example, where Germany is now realizing that relying on the Russians is probably not a good idea for energy security, and they're looking to countries like Canada that produce it ethically, cleanly, environmentally sensitively, that we can export that LNG. And the great thing about that is it reduces emissions by 50% in Asia, because it's a much cleaner fuel than, say, coal-fired power, which is where the majority of power is produced in Asia right now. So it's a great opportunity for us to make meaningful reductions in global emissions, while at the same time supporting a hugely important industry that supports a lot of healthcare and education in BC.
Common sense says that energy is in everything we do and use. And why does the NDP and the Liberal government not recognize that? Do they think that climate change, the way they're doing it, is more important than people being able to put food on their tables?
Well, honestly, I think governments have lost the plot. You know, people say to me, well, you once supported the carbon tax. And I say, of course I did. It's a market response. But remember, we supported it at 6 cents a litre. You know, it's now, more than doubled. It's at almost 15 cents a litre today. And they want to dramatically crank it up again over the next 7 years. And so I think where government's lost the plot is they haven't realized that, part of how we brought the public along with us is by making sure and making clear that this was not going to be a tax grab. So often what governments do is they profess to care a lot about the environment, but it always somehow ends up being picking people's pockets. And I think at the end of the day, we have to focus on results. British Columbians care about the environment. I know that is true. And there's lots we can do. Investments in rapid transit, encouraging people to get out of their cars. There's electric vehicles. There's all kinds of things. But we have to recognize that British Columbia represents 0.3% of global emissions. We are like a rounding error.
Incentivizing people as opposed to punishing people makes a lot more sense.
Absolutely.
Right? And then using technology to kind of like build a better future and address climate
Absolutely.
change.
Yeah, and I think technology is a big one. We've got a lot of really smart tech people in British Columbia, and I think that with the right supports, they can produce some of the breakthroughs that are going to help us have a cleaner, greener future. Even simple things like I'm in the heart of forest fire impacts right here in Kelowna. And just the fact that we don't need to be sending more committees out to study the problem. We need to make investments today that will prevent future forest fires, because the forest fires we saw in the summer, frankly, caused more carbon dioxide pollution than all the cars and trucks in British Columbia combined.
More energy on wildfire mitigation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's a big one for sure. We look out this window all the time. We see all those trees up there, and why they're still so close to homes and so as opposed to deciduous trees. That makes no sense, right?
Exactly. Deciduous trees and doing selective harvesting and opening up that canopy and allowing the sunlight to get through and making sure that we've got the proper breaks between communities and forests.
Because most fires are interface fires because they're human caused, right? So,
absolutely.
It seems like it's almost logical, like the approach that could be taken that would be, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that. Why isn't it happening? What's holding the government back, do you think, from
Well,
approach?
like I say, I think it goes back to losing the plot. I think that they want to be seen to be doing something on the environment, and that's a good thing, but they're not understanding that right now British Columbians are really struggling financially, and to just keep hitting them with carbon tax increases at a time when emissions are not going down. So it would be one thing if they could point to say, well, gee, look at how our emissions have declined in BC. They were declining when I was finance minister at 6 cents a litre. They're not declining right now with more than doubling of the carbon tax. And so just continuing to crank that up on people without getting the improvement in emissions, to me, is failed policy. So what can we do that works? What can we do that will get the buy-in from the public, but also see us getting the right kind of results? And that's where I think investments in rapid transit, investments in transit, encouraging people to get out of their cars, cycle, walk, all those kind of things make a lot more sense.
Moving on, let's move on to the vaccine mandate for healthcare workers in British Columbia. Is it time to let that go? Because we, in the newsroom here, we see small regional hospitals closing all the time now on the weekends and stuff like that they can't staff. And how many provinces still have this vaccine mandate for healthcare workers? Alberta doesn't.
Just British Columbia.
Yeah.
We're literally this one little spot in North America that's decided that we are going to continue to punish healthcare
Why is
workers.
that, though?
I don't know. There's no science to back it up. I've been calling for a change for over a year because I've said, look, many of the current healthcare workers in the system, They may have been originally vaccinated, but we don't know whether they've got their booster shots. They are effectively, many of them, probably unvaccinated right now, if you're basing it on science. So why are we discriminating against those that, for whatever reason, chose not to be vaccinated, especially when you've got masks in the
To me, it seems
hospitals
more
right now?
political than it does scientific at this point.
Very ideological, I would argue, with this government. I think the
Right.
NDP, for whatever reason, has decided that they are going to have a crusade against healthcare workers. And at a time when we've got, emergency departments shutting down, we've got hospitals that can barely keep up, to leave thousands of healthcare workers on the sidelines that are willing and able to come back to the healthcare system doesn't make any
Like
sense.
the damage that's happening at the hospital level due to errors, mistakes, the anecdotal stories that you're starting to hear, it just seems like it's in upheaval. In fact, the whole system right now.
The system is the worst I've ever seen it. And I say that in all honesty. I was in Surrey recently, meeting with the doctors there, and they told me to a person they've never seen the system as bad as it is today. Literally, they are organizing rallies. The doctors are organizing rallies on weekends, taking time out of their own schedules to protest to the government about just how bad things really are in the hospitals.
If you're in Merritt,
Yeah.
and you have to drive to Kamloops or somewhere because supposedly you don't want an unvaccinated nurse or doctor working on you, which to me doesn't make a lot of sense, right? At this stage of the game, right?
Well, and look at the irony. I mean, we've got a government that is sending cancer patients south to Bellingham, to a facility in Bellingham where they're unvaccinated.
Right.
Apparently, that's not an issue to the government. So, if they're so ideologically opposed to having unvaccinated healthcare workers, why are we sending Canadians?
So is it the
cancer
egos?
patients down to
Yeah.
Bellingham?
Is it the ego? Do you know what I mean?
I think
Like,
it's
is it-
ideological. I
Yeah.
really do. I think that they just dug in their heels, and because there's no science to back it up. The best they can say is, well, we're being precautionary. Well, nowhere else in North America is taking the same approach. So why is it just in BC they see fit to punish?
Well, will it take a
unvaccinated
change of
workers?
government and
And
a
not only
lawsuit?
the
or what?
unvaccinated
Yes.
workers, but the public too, because the results are disastrous.
Well, that's the issue. I think that's the problem, is that the public's paying the price. And, at the end of the day, the public is reasonable. Not everyone, some people may still feel nervous about unvaccinated workers coming back, but remember, they're going to be wearing masks in the hospital. We've got testing. They can be tested. This is something that's very manageable. So the only logical rationale for why they continue to do it is because they've got an ideological obsession about punishing these folks. And I think at a time when our healthcare system is virtually in collapse, we need every worker we can possibly get to help out.
I would think so. Another one, Airbnb. Is it just another tool of distraction being used by the government to pit people against each other as opposed to like a failed housing plan?
Yes, it is, unfortunately, because, look, after 7 years, I think the government is desperate now because the policies that they've instituted so far have resulted in the worst possible outcomes. As I said earlier, the highest, most unaffordable housing in North America and the highest average rents in Canada. So now they bring in this idea around Airbnbs. The problem is they didn't go and consult with people. We brought forward some very reasonable recommendations that said, for example, let's go after the minority of the people that own Airbnbs that run it like a business. They've got multiple, sometimes up to couple of dozen Airbnbs. Right. Okay, fine. Put some controls on those folks. But the people that own one unit, you shouldn't be punishing them.
Or the people that followed all the
Or that
rules
follow
and
all the
regulations and they bought purpose-built buildings for it and stuff
Absolutely.
like that.
I actually received emails from individuals. I remember a young millennial couple that they're renters today, but they have an Airbnb. They're using that to pay down the mortgage on it in the hopes that one day they'll move into it. Their life has been turned completely upside down now as a result of these government changes. And I think at the end of the day, they're not going to work. That's the real tragedy. It's going to mean all the unintended consequences that the NDP government has not even thought about are going to come to the fore. And for example, we've got Taylor Swift coming here, next year. Everyone's excited about that for sure. But imagine that 164,000 people are going to descend on Vancouver from across the province, across the country, around the world. And where are they going to stay? Well, the Airbnbs are no longer going to be an option. So suddenly they're looking at, $1,200 a night hotel rooms.
And about that, I've heard, and I don't know if it's fact or not, but I've heard that a lot of the hotels in Vancouver, due to their inability to attract staffing and all that kind of stuff, are showing sold out or close to sold out and charging premium rates, but actually have full floor shut down because they don't have somebody to actually work it.
Yes, that's been the case across the province, actually. You'll see at many hotels and motels, they haven't got the cleaning staff available to look after all the rooms, and so they're operating at 70% occupancy just because they haven't got the staffing. So yeah, I just think, look, at the end of the day, I think it's government trying to show they're doing something, but they will not get the intended result. And that's the real tragedy, because I do genuinely think that we want to make sure we've got rental units available for folks that are trying to get a place to live. But, maybe the government ought to look at their own policies that they've put in place that make people very reluctant to rent out their properties, for example, because we know about some of the abuses that we see, the imbalance between landlords and tenants that result in landlords not being able to get rid of really bad, nasty tenants that are destroying their properties, not paying their bills, etc. That creates a problem too.
And shouldn't we look at home ownership too, as opposed to just always rentals? Because how do we get more people, young people especially, into homes? And one of the things that an idea is why not all these small communities all over British Columbia that people are moving away from being encouraged into move cities, they have lots of lots available. How do we incentivize people to move back into smaller communities and buy a home as opposed to always being a renter?
Well, as someone that spent decades in the housing sector, it's an area that I actually know pretty well. And I think the big challenge I see in the government is that none of them come from a private sector background. And certainly none of them have any experience in housing. And so you've got these people with no experience trying to design a housing platform that's going to actually get different results. They don't know what they're doing, and I say that in the nicest possible way. They mean well, but they just don't know what they're doing.
DCCs keep going up,
absolutely, yeah. Like just now, a regional DCC in the Lower Mainland is going to add $25,000 a unit in housing and additional fees. Well, that's not making housing more affordable. No. The Premier could say, no, I will not let that happen. He has to sign off on those Metro Vancouver DCCs, but he refuses to do so. They bring in legislation recently that expands the ability of municipalities to charge even more on DCCs. They're expanding it to policing, to firefighting costs, et cetera, that can be loaded onto DCCs. That doesn't make housing less expensive. It makes it more expensive. And so, there's lots of things we can do. You're right. In smaller communities, if the province would go to those communities and say, you know what, we will fund a lot of your infrastructure costs to build this housing, because that's the big barrier. Yeah. And then we'll get it back later through the future, development cost charges or property taxes or what have you. We can work with local communities to make that happen. But again, we've just got people that frankly don't quite know what they're doing when it comes to housing.
Because if we look at COVID brought us that opportunity where a lot of people and employers now are saying, well, we can look at that work from home model. So communities like, Salmos and Greenwood, because I know that I grew up in that little small town, they're an opportunity, and there's tons of them, Grand Forks, all around us too, like Enderby, Armstrong, even here, right?
Absolutely. And imagine if we had a government that said, for the 200,000 immigrants that are coming into the province every year, what if we worked to actually induce them to go into smaller communities?
Yeah.
Where housing will be, where housing will be more affordable, where there's lots of employment opportunities, lots of chances to, become entrepreneurs or what have you. I think that's a great opportunity, but it requires a plan. You've got to execute on the plan. You've got to make sure that as those immigrants are arriving, you say to them, look, I know Surrey and Richmond might be great options, but there's some really great options here, and here's some financial incentive for you to move to different parts of the province.
Because I was just in Salmo, and the downtowns and a lot of those small places are getting all boarded up because there's no people, right? And they have infrastructure built already. They have water, and they have, power and gas and everything. So
absolutely, yeah. No, I think that's a big opportunity that we're overlooking, quite frankly.
One of the big ones that we all see out there is addiction. We see the people suffering from addiction, the homelessness, and all that. Is there a better plan from your party?
Oh yes, very much so. This is something I'm very close to and feel very passionately about, because I've known people that have died from both mental health issues
all do now, right?
And addiction issues. Exactly. So I think we've all been touched. I think one thing we have to do is recognize that in government, if you're doing something and you're getting really bad results, it's important that you have the wherewithal to say, you know what, these are not very good results we're getting. We better change direction. We've seen every year since 2016, the overdose death rates have increased to the highest levels ever in history. And yet government is doubling down to do more of the same thing, expecting to get different results. So what would we do differently? Well, this is what excites me. I spent 10 years on the board of the Street to Home Foundation working with homelessness in the Vancouver area. And I can tell you there are different approaches that can get different results. Number one, we have to invest in modernized river views. So in other words, we have to have purpose-built facilities, not just at Riverview in Coquitlam, but also in the Okanagan, the North, the Kootenays, and the Island, where we can take people with untreated severe mental health issues and put them into secure facilities with 24/7 psychiatric and medical supports so they can get the care and attention they deserve and need. That will deal with a lot of the sort of the chaos and stuff that you're seeing on the streets from people that are not capable of making good decisions in their own best interest. Then we have to say, for those that are struggling with addictions, just providing them publicly supplied addictive drugs is not a solution. We have to focus on treatment, help them get off of their addiction. So we will invest upfront in treatment to help people get better. I think that's really important. And frankly, the final thing that government's done that has really made things worse is they said, let's decriminalize all hard drugs like heroin and cocaine and methamphetamine and fentanyl without any guardrails. And because of that, we've seen open drug use in parks, playgrounds, beaches, public spaces, and that has been a huge tragedy. And now the government, after we've been pressuring them for the better part of a year, has said, okay, well, we'll bring in some legislation that brings in some restrictions, but frankly, not enough. And it's a little bit of too little too late because the animals have already left the barn, the doors are closed, and now we're going to have to try and clean up the situation that's escalated out in the streets. And so, yes, there are better approaches, and I'm excited about implementing those so we can get different results.
The additional tools or the guardrails, I guess, is what I'm looking for. What kind of guardrails would you have in mind?
Well, for example, saying that we need to make sure we're educating our children in schools, make sure that kids really understand that drugs are very, very dangerous. We've got a government that allows people to go into our schools on Vancouver Island. We had an incident earlier in the year where, they were having people come in to teach kids how to safely snort cocaine. This is ridiculous. We should be having people in the schools saying, drugs are actually very, very dangerous, and here's what you need to know, kids. It's very different than it was a generation ago. You can die just by experimenting with drugs. So please, don't use drugs. And there's none of that happening right now to the kind of scale that we need in this province. The other thing is restrictions on open drug use. Back when I was in government in the early 2000s, as part of the BC Liberal government, which we are now called BC United, we back then said we want to deal with youth smoking rates because we had, accelerating, increasing rates of youth smoking. So what did we do? We banned smoking in legions, in restaurants, in office buildings, in transit, in public spaces. And then we said to the federal government, you need to create more packaging awareness to make sure that kids know that smoking is dangerous. And we had education programs. And guess what? The smoking rates went down. Well, if we followed this government's approach on drugs with what we did with smoking, we would have been saying, okay, free cigarettes for everybody and smoke wherever you want. And of course, that would be stupid, but that's what we're doing. That's literally what we're doing right now with drugs. And we're not getting good outcomes by that. So we have to be smart about this. Is there a role to help people transition when they're highly addicted? Can there be, safe supply to help transition them to treatment? Yes, for sure. In a clinical setting with proper oversight, yes, I support that tremendously. But that's not what they're doing. They are just wildly handing out free drugs.
There seems to be some middle ground that's missing. And I'll come back to the decriminalization aspect of it. Everything you say and have said, I agree with. I worry about recriminalizing to a certain extent because I think that was actually, of all the things the BC government has done, NDP, is decriminalizing. I think that intent, if that intent is to not put people in jail who are feeling so much pain in their life that they're trying to cover it up with drugs, which is essentially what happens when somebody gets put in jail for consuming drugs. I don't think that's fair. I don't think it's right. But I also think that there needs to be personal responsibility and not impact other people who are not using drugs and have children playing in playgrounds and all that kind of stuff, right? So how do we get to that middle ground, that reasonableness? Actually,
that's what we've been saying. We've said the problem is their reckless decriminalization was done without the kind of guardrails in place to make sure it can be a success. Look, nobody, including the police, I have many, many friends that are police officers, police chiefs, that tell me all the time, Kevin, we weren't charging people with 2.5 grams or less anyhow. That was never a big issue. The problem is they took away the one tool the police do have. When somebody, for example, is using drugs openly in a playground, they used to be able to go up and be able to seize their drugs and move them along.
But they can't do that now?
They can't do that. No, because it's decriminalized.
But they can take away their alcohol?
Yes, exactly. They can tell you can't smoke on a public beach. In Vancouver, for example, there's no smoking. You can't even use a plastic straw. You certainly can't drink alcohol, but you can openly use drugs. And that was the problem. And we always said, you've got to have guardrails in place. I saw there was a case of a young mom in Nanaimo, Allison Miller, whose 5-year-old daughter brought home a baggie from her playground to show to her little brother because it had these cool colored little squares in them like stamps. And she thought that'd be neat to show her little 2-year-old brother. And fortunately, they were playing under the table and opening up the bag, and the mom saw and said, "Where'd you get that?" And she said, "I found it at school at the playground." She took it. Turned out it was fentanyl. Those kids could have died. So we're just saying there's got to be reasonable guardrails around this, and the government just refused for the longest time until all the municipalities started piling on and saying that this was becoming a real problem with the open drug use throughout their communities.
But now there's a nursing group that's trying to open the door even further, and
Well, they're just trying to fight back against that,
I guess.
that bill. But
Yeah, they are. And look, I think we should be clear. There's other groups too. The government's funded a group called the Drug User Liberation Front that was buying drugs on the dark web and trafficking them in Vancouver. And this is not helpful at all. I mean, I think the whole thing is just spun out of control. But again, we've lost the plot. What are we trying to do here? I think we ought to be saying, well, let's try and get people that are struggling. They've got maybe trauma in their lives, or which is very common. Let's help them get into a path of recovery. But I think that right now, if you try to get treatment or recovery in British Columbia, it's very, very difficult. And, just handing out drugs to people to, keep them breathing is frankly that's not a good enough solution. We have to help people get better. That's what I care about. I want people to get better.
it seems like another failed policy that they're using, like they're appealing to people's heartstrings to say, oh, we're because they're not doing the hard work, the heavy lifting, right? Like, how do we help people?
Yeah, and this is the thing. Like I always say, if we were getting improved results, I'd be the first one to say, what? I'm surprised. I would have thought that these kind of policies wouldn't work at all, but we're not. And so I think it's incumbent upon the government after 7 years to say, maybe we need to think about a different approach, or just relax their current. Which
or a
I
couple
would
of
argue,
streams, right? Just a couple of streams.
Yeah, a couple of streams, and
see
especially a stream that says to people that want to get well,
Right.
here's a path to recovery for you. And we recognize in recovery there's going to be trips and falls. That's the way it is. But we're going to be supporting you along the way. And the other thing, I really worry about the next generation. I mean, it's hard to get someone that's 55 and has had decades of addiction to recover. It's going to be a big challenge. But my goodness, that 14 or 15-year-old, those are the kids that we need to make sure they don't go into that path.
I think we need to instill hope back to our youth for sure too, and that some of that hope is buying a house, not being a renter.
Yes.
Right? Because I've heard from some people that say, young people don't want to own a home. I think a lot of young people think they can't own a home, and I think we need to put that hope back where home ownership is part of that, and a lot of the addiction stuff comes around from being homeless too, right? Because you end up out in that environment, and then it's pretty lousy environment, and we won't stay there too long. I do have a question for you. You mentioned it, your name change.
Yeah.
Good idea, bad idea?
Well, I think it'll be a good idea at the end of the day. Look, we always recognize that we only changed our name, 7 or 8 months ago.
Yeah.
And so it's not like all British Columbians are going to suddenly realize, the BC Liberals are now BC United. It will take some time, but I'm very, very confident that of two things. Number one, I think the name itself is important, BC United. We're trying to unite people behind good ideas, a free enterprise system that rewards people for initiative, that if you work hard, you can get ahead, that you can grow your paycheck, not shrink it, that we can be a place where young people especially, can look forward to having the dream of ownership be real. But to do that, I think we do have to bring people together. It's too easy to divide people. I think I see across North America and around the world today, there is a real trend to divide people and create division in society.
Seems to be the path.
It does seem to be the path, and I'm not going to do that. I'd rather lose 100 elections than to be a divisive leader. I do think that we can bring people together, and that's what BC United's all about. Regardless of where you were born or what God you choose to pray to or who you choose to love, I do think that people could come together united by good principles that want to have a better future. And so will people figure that out right away? No, of course not. It'll take some time. But I tell you this, people don't give the public enough credit. They're way smarter than we give them credit for. In Vancouver, we had an election with a mayor with a new party that a year prior to the election didn't exist, the ABC, and they won virtually every seat in council, just over a year later. So I'm not too concerned. I think by the time the election rolls around, people will realize BC United is the former BC Liberals. They've got experience, they've got great candidates, good policies, and they're ready to step into place and govern.
Our good neighbors to the east of us, Alberta, have always been good friends for British Columbia, but lately not so much. And how do we fix that relationship too? And Danielle Smith seems to be doing a great job over there. So,
Yeah.
I mean, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah,
So-
well, you're right. Fixing the relationship is important. There's not much of a relationship right now, for sure. And it frankly doesn't get better when we have a national premiers meeting and all the premiers basically say this idea of the Prime Minister providing carbon tax relief for home heating fuel in one part of the country but not the other was roundly criticized by almost all of the premiers except David Eby. David Eby is the only one that didn't come forward and say there should be carbon tax relief on home heating fuels in British Columbia too. All the other premiers did. In fact, they showed real leadership. Scott Moe in Saskatchewan said, look, we're not even going to collect it anymore if that's how you're going to treat Westerners. And I just feel that that was a leadership moment that the premier here missed. Now, in terms of Alberta, we always, while we were in government, while I was in government, back with Gordon Campbell and Christy Clark, we used to have regular meetings with the cabinet in Alberta. We worked cooperatively together to open up trade between Alberta and British Columbia. We advocated on federal issues together so that we could unite and have a common voice. None of that's happening today, and I think it's a shame.
Yeah, the West used to be really strong, right?
Absolutely.
Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. Like so.
Even actually, ironically, the Alberta NDP support our position of removing the carbon tax from home heating fuels in BC, whether it's natural gas, propane, or oil. Even the federal NDP, for God's sakes, has come out in support of that. The only people in the entire country that continue to support the current position is apparently David Eby and the NDP in British Columbia. I cannot believe it. This should be an easy one for them.
Do you think that, like, we looked at the Alberta election, again, very strong in most of Alberta other than Edmonton and parts of Calgary.
Yes.
Again, the same thing goes for British Columbia, right? Like, it's very, like, the Lower Mainland basically decides the direction of British Columbia.
Yes.
And then we, meanwhile, like Dawson Creeks and Fort St. John's and Kelowna's and that don't have as much say. How do we make that more fair? Because they benefit, the Lower Mainland and Edmonton's and Calgary's benefit from all these tax dollars that build, huge arenas and all kinds of infrastructure that their residents get to enjoy. But, like smaller communities don't get that kind of stuff. So how do we make that representation more fair?
Well, I think it's important that, British Columbians elect a government and individuals that have a track record of understanding they have to govern for the entire province. I think this is really, really important because I do think that we have a government today that is very much an urban government. It's all about the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island. They've pretty much made their decision that that's where they think they can win and hold elections. And I refuse to just be a Lower Mainland focused MLA or a leader. I think we have to govern for the entire province. When I was Minister of Transportation and we built the William Bennett Bridge, it was because we knew that was important for the region. When we, widened the highway, 97 down through to Penticton, that was about making sure that we deal with the growth in population here. So you have to govern for the entire province. The fact that the three biggest projects underway in British Columbia right now, and this is really important, Site C, the twinning of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and the Canada LNG project, those are the three largest projects in the history of this province. All three of them were opposed by the current government. Imagine if those three didn't exist today. That just the LNG project is the largest private sector investment in the history of this country, and it's taken place in BC. This is something that we ought to be singing and praising from the treetops. You never hear the government talk about it. I talk about it because I know it's important for the entire province, not just Kitimat, not just Terrace, not just Prince George in the north, but the entire province. The benefits flow through to everything we do.
How do you counteract when a government, like when they ran that snap election there, and they offered, I think it was a $400 or $500 rent credit to buy votes, basically. How do you counteract that? Like, do you just say, well, double that, or what do you do? Because it seems so like it's basically buying votes from the Lower Mainland, basically, because people are just, well, I get a rent credit. And,
what I'm going to say to British Columbians is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to ask this question. Are you better off today than you were 8 years ago? Is anything more affordable today? Do the 30 new and increased taxes this government's introduced make your life any easier? Does the fact that you're facing, young people especially, the highest housing prices in North America, is that a good result? The highest rents in Canada, the highest fuel prices in North America. So at some point, I think, you ask British Columbians that basic question, and I think the answer is going to be no, because it's not just my opinion. this is what all the independent facts tell us. We know that BC is the most unaffordable province in the country. So if you want something different, you have to elect different people that are going to focus on genuinely reducing costs for family. That's what 15 cents a litre elimination of the provincial fuel tax is all about. I want to make things less
How do
expensive.
governments get away with that right now, both in provincial and federal, where they say a lot of the issues aren't their responsibility, or there's outside world issues and stuff like that, but they've had the steering wheel for 4 and 8 years.
Yeah, exactly.
And, and the stuff they run over seems to be their responsibility, but they say it's not.
Yeah.
And then, and I'll bring in our Bill C-18, a local independent media. We don't even get to ask questions typically of, especially federal politics, or like, we're glad to have this chance with you, but we don't typically get a chance to talk to David Eby and stuff like that. So because there's, the approved media, the legacy media gets that. And it seems like they're not asking the tough questions, like, you're responsible for where we are.
Well, I think this is so important because it's true. Like, when you're in government, you have to be held accountable. I want to be held accountable for results. I genuinely do.
Media's number one job, hold power accountable.
Totally. And media and the public. I think the public should hold politicians way more accountable too. Because you're right, at the end of the day, if after being in government for 7 years and 8 by the time the election's called in October next year, if government has the worst outcomes in every area, they can't just keep pointing fingers. No. At some point, it's got to be their responsibility.
You've had the wheel.
They've had the wheel. And the problem is, I think, honestly, as I watch this government, I don't think they're bad people. I genuinely think they mean well. I don't believe people get elected to say, let's just destroy, ruin the economy and healthcare. But I think the challenge they face is they don't know how to execute. They don't know how to get things done because they don't have that background in the private sector. And so they struggle to know how to get results. And ultimately, they have to be held accountable for that lack of results.
I think that's perspective for a lot of people. And they did look at it through their own lens. Like, if we look at, our finance minister in Canada, saying things like, I don't even have a car, but she has a chauffeur-driven limousine. Yeah. She has a $350,000 salary. She lives close. You know what I mean? Like, and then the rest of Canada and Yellowknife and that don't have that. They have to drive their car. They have to drive. They have to do things like that. And like in checking their bills for Disney and stuff like that. It seems oblivious to me, right?
It's oblivious, and it drives me crazy. When this government gave themselves as a cabinet and a premier undeserved pay increases that we were not supportive of, when they gave their own political staff employees a 17% wage increase earlier in the year that was completely undeserved at a time when British Columbians are really struggling. That really bothers me because it just sends absolutely the wrong message. They've grown the size of government by 36% in 7 years, okay? And I always ask British Columbians a simple question. Has anyone seen a 36% improvement in any service government delivers? And I have yet to hear anyone in any crowd that I've spoken to put up their hands and say, yes, actually, this area improved.
Is that why they need the carbon tax?
It's part of it, yes, because they're having to fund their massive explosion of spending. And, I'll tell you, I think that the chickens are coming home to roost because British Columbians are now realizing, oh my God, not only am I weighed under with all these additional taxes that they've been imposing over the last 7 years, but now my mortgage is coming up for renewal if you're lucky enough to own a home. And suddenly people are seeing $600, $1,000, $1,200 a month more just from their interest increases. Well, that's scary.
We look to Alberta right now too, and we see they're getting like net migration in and companies moving in and stuff like that too, and and they're seeing their economies kind of, and that's under Danielle Smith. And is that something we could look forward to if your party?
Absolutely. In fact, I just met someone last night that was telling me they lost 2 employees in the last 2 weeks that went to Alberta. And they went to Alberta because housing is much more affordable. You can buy a home in Red Deer for under $300,000. You can buy places in Calgary for $400,000 to $500,000. And they look at British Columbia and say, well, I'll never get into this housing market. And I pay way too much in taxes. And frankly, they don't see a path to anything getting more affordable in this province. We have to change that. We have to make it more affordable in British Columbia, or we're going to lose all our young people to other provinces. And I'm not going to let that happen. I think this is a mission critical issue for me, making things less expensive for British Columbians. I'm going to make no bones about it. We have to tighten our belts in government the same way we ask the public to tighten theirs, and that means being responsible. It doesn't mean, cutting frontline jobs. That's what the NDP will always say, oh, he's going to cut doctors and nurses. Who in their right minds would talk about cutting any doctors and nurses when we have a huge shortage? I want to bring people back into the health system. And I can tell you we're losing doctors and nurses because they're fed up with the current system. They're fed up with being called into work all the time. And they're also fed up with living in the most unaffordable province in the country. We can fix that.
How fed up are they about not having a voice when it comes to these vaccine mandate policies too? I mean, like, in terms of, it seems that the grassroots science, what we see on the ground, isn't allowed to emerge and be a part of the policy debate and discussion.
Well,
it's frustrated at that level.
It's mixed, to be honest with you. Yeah. Like I met with the nurses union recently, and they're fantastic. They're just doing an exceptional job. I have a tremendous amount of respect for them. They don't support my position, candidly, on unvaccinated workers coming back into the health sector. And they've got their reasons for it, and some of it's historical and some of the divisiveness that went on during the vaccine mandates. But again, to me, it is about a principle. What is the principle? The principle is we have to pay attention to what science tells us. And if the government cannot provide the science to back up their decision to exclude thousands of healthcare workers at a time when we're in a healthcare crisis, then frankly, that's not compelling to me, especially given that they could provide some basic protections. We already have mask requirements to wear masks in our healthcare setting right now in hospitals. So they could provide testing, which would be very simple to do for those healthcare workers coming back. But does anyone really think it makes sense to keep thousands of healthcare workers out of our system at a time when the system is in a massive state of crisis? I don't think so. And until they provide the evidence to support their decision as being the only jurisdiction in North America that continues with this policy, I don't think it's supportable.
So, with that all said, is there anything else you'd like to say? Because I know that you've got an appointment you've got to get to. Your aide is getting anxious there.
Oh, yeah, no problem. Well, no, I'd just like to say that, at the end of the day, I'm very optimistic. I think we do live in the greatest province and the greatest country in the world, and we have so much potential. We've got an incredibly diverse population of smart people that are, potentially can achieve a lot. And what we need is government working alongside, not against people. And I think if we can just get to a place where people can see that government can actually make life less expensive and can, create a scenario where you feel optimistic about the future. That's what happened when I was first in government. I remember getting elected in 2001, and the first day in office, we did a 25% across the board personal income tax cut. And we did that because under 10 years of NDP that preceded us, we ended up with the highest income tax rates in North America. And today we're at the same level. So we have to get back to leaving more money in people's pockets, growing paychecks, not shrinking them, and giving people excitement about the future again. And I think we can do that.
I mean, if you look out the window, we live in one of the most beautiful areas in the world. Yeah. Never mind just in Canada, but British Columbia is supernatural.
Absolutely.
The old phrase we used to have.
Yeah.
It is beautiful. And we do thank you for your time today, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, that was excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well,